The morning sun shone brightly over London as the city prepared for one of the most spectacular celebrations in recent memory. It was June 5th, 2022, and the Platinum Jubilee Pageant was about to begin. Streets were decorated with red, white, and blue bunting, and thousands of people had gathered along the procession route, hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal family. In Kensington Palace, 4-year-old Prince Louis was getting dressed for what would become one of the most memorable public appearances of his young life. His mother, Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, carefully helped him into his smart navy blue suit, complete with a crisp white shirt and perfectly polished shoes. Louis fidgeted constantly, his energy barely contained even at this early hour. "Now, Louis, remember what we talked about," Catherine said gently, smoothing down his blonde hair. "Today is very special for great-grandmother. We need to sit nicely and watch the parade." Louis nodded enthusiastically, though his attention was already wandering to the window where he could see cars arriving and people bustling about in preparation. His older siblings, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, were also getting ready, both appearing much more composed than their youngest brother. The family made their way to the special viewing area that had been set up for the royal family. The platform overlooked the mall, giving them a perfect view of the entire pageant route. As they took their seats, Louis's eyes grew wide with wonder at the sight before him. Thousands of people lined the streets, many waving flags and cheering even though the parade hadn't started yet. Prince William sat beside his youngest son, placing a gentle hand on Louis's shoulder. The little boy was practically bouncing in his seat, his excitement palpable to everyone around him. The other royal family members took their places, including the Queen herself, who sat regally in the center of the viewing area. As the pageant began, Louis's fascination was immediately captured by the first group of performers. Military bands marched past in perfect formation, their instruments gleaming in the sunlight. The sound of drums and trumpets filled the air, and Louis couldn't help but move his little body to the rhythm of the music. "Look, Papa!" Louis exclaimed, pointing at a group of soldiers on horseback. His voice carried clearly over the dignified murmur of the other royals, causing several heads to turn in his direction with amused smiles. The pageant continued with float after float, celebrating different aspects of British culture and history. There were dancers in colorful costumes, vintage cars carrying important dignitaries, and elaborate displays representing different decades of the Queen's reign. Each new sight brought fresh excitement from Louis, who seemed incapable of sitting still for more than a few seconds at a time. When a group of acrobats appeared, performing impressive stunts as they moved along the route, Louis stood up completely, pressing against the barrier for a better view. Catherine gently guided him back to his seat, but his enthusiasm was infectious, and even the more reserved members of the royal family found themselves smiling at his genuine joy. The little prince's reactions became increasingly animated as the pageant progressed. He clapped enthusiastically at every performance, waved energetically at the crowd below, and provided running commentary on everything he saw, much to the delight of photographers who were capturing every moment. "Mama, did you see that man juggling fire?" Louis asked loudly, tugging on Catherine's sleeve. His innocent excitement and complete lack of royal reserve was beginning to draw attention from both the crowd and the media covering the event. As more performers passed by, including a spectacular dragon puppet that required dozens of people to operate, Louis's behavior became even more exuberant. He made faces at the cameras, stuck out his tongue playfully, and seemed completely unaware that millions of people around the world were watching his every move. The royal family's usual composed demeanor was being tested by Louis's natural childlike enthusiasm, but rather than being embarrassed, they seemed to embrace his infectious joy. Even the Queen was seen chuckling at her great-grandson's antics, clearly amused by his uninhibited reactions to the spectacular show unfolding before them all. As the Platinum Jubilee pageant continued, Prince Louis's behavior became increasingly unpredictable and entertaining. The formal royal protocol that usually governs such events seemed to have no effect on the spirited 4-year-old, who was experiencing everything with the pure wonder and lack of inhibition that only a young child could display. When a marching band played a particularly lively tune, Lewis began conducting along with the music, his small arms waving dramatically in the air. His impromptu conducting drew chuckles from nearby family members and caught the attention of television cameras, which zoomed in to capture his enthusiastic performance. Catherine leaned over to gently guide Lewis's hands down, whispering something in his ear that made him giggle. But within moments, he was back to his animated responses, this time making exaggerated, surprised faces at a group of performers dressed as giant butterflies. The contrast between Lewis's natural, unfiltered reactions and the carefully controlled responses of the other royal family members created a fascinating dynamic. While Prince George sat quietly beside his father, occasionally whispering questions about the performers, and Princess Charlotte maintained perfect posture while politely applauding, Lewis seemed to exist in his own world of excitement and wonder. When a float featuring circus performers came into view, Lewis's reaction was so enthusiastic that he nearly knocked over his small chair. He jumped up and down, pointing excitedly at the acrobats performing on the moving platform. His obvious delight was so genuine that several performers on the float noticed him and waved specifically in his direction, which only increased his excitement. "They're waving at me," Lewis announced proudly to anyone within hearing distance. His voice carried clearly in the relatively quiet royal viewing area, causing more amused looks from the assembled dignitaries and family members. Prince William tried to encourage his son to lower his voice, but Lewis was far too captivated by the spectacle to pay much attention to such requests. When a group of dancers in elaborate feathered costumes performed a complex routine, Lewis attempted to copy their movements from his seat, his little body wiggling and swaying with complete abandon. The photographers and camera operators covering the event began to focus more and more on Lewis, recognizing that his spontaneous reactions were providing some of the most genuine and heartwarming moments of the entire celebration. His innocent joy and complete lack of self-consciousness created a sharp contrast to the formal atmosphere typical of royal events. As a magnificent float representing the 1960s passed by, complete with actors portraying famous musicians and cultural icons, Lewis's excitement reached new heights. He began singing along to the music, though the words he sang bore little resemblance to the actual lyrics. His impromptu performance drew smiles from everyone around him, including security personnel who were trying to maintain their professional composure. Catherine and William exchanged glances that seemed to communicate both mild concern about their son's increasingly boisterous behavior and genuine amusement at his infectious enthusiasm. They appeared to be weighing the need to maintain royal dignity against allowing their young son to simply enjoy this once-in-a-lifetime experience. When Lewis spotted a performer dressed as an enormous puppet resembling a famous children's book character, his reaction was so dramatic that it momentarily stopped conversations throughout the royal viewing area. He gasped loudly, pointed with both hands, and turned to his mother with such obvious delight that Catherine couldn't help but laugh out loud. The little prince's energy seemed endless. While other children his age might have grown tired or restless during such a long event, Lewis appeared to become more animated with each passing float. His genuine reactions to every new sight and sound created an atmosphere of joy that seemed to spread to those around him. As the pageant continued, Lewis discovered that he could get reactions from the crowd below by waving and making faces. This discovery led to increasingly elaborate performances from the young prince, who seemed delighted to realize that thousands of people were watching and responding to his antics. His behavior was becoming the talk of the event, with spectators and media commentators noting how refreshing it was to see such authentic, unscripted joy during what was typically a very formal and controlled royal occasion. The 4-year-old was unknowingly stealing the show from the carefully orchestrated performances below. The third hour of the Platinum Jubilee Pageant brought with it the moment that would define Prince Louis's public image and create one of the most viral royal moments in modern history. As a particularly elaborate float featuring vintage aircraft and military displays approached, Lewis's excitement reached what seemed like its peak, but he was just getting started. The 4-year-old had discovered that covering his ears during loud musical numbers created an amusing visual, and he began experimenting with different variations of this gesture. Sometimes he would cover his ears with his hands, sometimes he would scrunch up his entire face, and occasionally he would do both while making exaggerated expressions of surprise or mock terror. When the Royal Air Force fly past thundered overhead, Lewis's reaction was nothing short of spectacular. The roar of the aircraft engines was indeed quite loud, but instead of simply covering his ears like a normal child might, Lewis created a performance that would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms. He covered his ears dramatically, opened his mouth in an exaggerated expression of shock, and then began making faces that seemed to suggest the noise was the most incredible thing he had ever experienced. His theatrical response caught the attention of every camera operator in the area, and close-up shots of his animated expressions were immediately broadcast to viewers around the world. But Lewis wasn't finished. As the aircraft continued to fly overhead, he removed his hands from his ears and began waving enthusiastically at the sky, as if the pilots could see his tiny figure among the thousands of people below. His innocent belief that he could personally acknowledge each aircraft created a moment of pure childhood magic that resonated with viewers of all ages. The crowd's reaction to Lewis's antics was becoming as much a part of the story as the pageant itself. People in the viewing areas around the royal family were clearly delighted by the little prince's unscripted performance, and many were pulling out their phones to capture their own videos of his reactions. Catherine and William's approach to managing their son's increasingly spirited behavior became a study in royal parenting under pressure. They would occasionally lean over to gently redirect his attention or whisper instructions, but they seemed to recognize that trying to completely suppress his natural enthusiasm would be both futile and potentially counterproductive. When a float featuring a live jazz band passed by, Lewis discovered his love for dancing. He began moving his shoulders and swaying his head to the music, creating what could only be described as his own interpretation of jazz choreography. His impromptu dance moves were so endearing that even the musicians on the float noticed and began playing with extra enthusiasm, seemingly energized by the young royal's obvious appreciation. The moment that would become the most famous, however, occurred when Lewis decided to engage directly with the cameras. Having noticed that the large television cameras were frequently pointed in his direction, he began making deliberate faces directly into the lenses. His repertoire included surprised expressions, silly faces, and what appeared to be his attempt at a serious, grown-up look. These direct camera interactions created an immediate sensation among television viewers and social media users. The images of Lewis making faces at the camera were shared thousands of times within minutes, with people around the world commenting on his adorable audacity and natural charisma. Prince George and Princess Charlotte, meanwhile, maintained their composed behavior throughout their brother's increasingly theatrical display. George occasionally looked at Lewis with what appeared to be mild bewilderment, while Charlotte seemed to find her younger brother's antics quietly amusing, though she remained perfectly poised in her own seat. The contrast between the three Cambridge children became a topic of fascination for royal watchers and child development experts alike. Here were three children from the same family, in the same environment, displaying completely different approaches to public behavior. As the pageant continued, Lewis's confidence seemed to grow with each positive reaction he received. He began experimenting with different ways to get attention, from elaborate waving techniques to funny faces to impromptu dance moves. Each new performance seemed to delight the crowd more than the last, creating a feedback loop of enthusiasm between the young prince and his audience. The royal protection officers and event organizers watched this unprecedented display with a mixture of professional concern and human amusement. Never before had such a young member of the royal family created such a sustained and widely observed breach of royal protocol. Yet the reaction from both the crowd and the media was overwhelmingly positive. By this point in the pageant, Louis had essentially created his own parallel entertainment for the thousands of people who could see the royal viewing area. While the official pageant continued below, many spectators found themselves watching the young prince's reactions with as much interest as they showed for the carefully planned performances. As the Platinum Jubilee Pageant entered its fourth hour, even Prince Louis's seemingly endless energy began to show signs of flagging. The combination of excitement, sensory overload, and the natural rhythm of a 4-year-old's attention span started to create a new dynamic in the royal viewing area. The first signs of Louis's changing mood appeared when he began fidgeting more restlessly in his seat. Instead of his earlier enthusiastic pointing and exclaiming, he started to lean against his mother, occasionally rubbing his eyes despite his obvious determination to continue watching the spectacle before him. Catherine, recognizing the signs of an overtired child, began to employ various parenting strategies to help Louis maintain his composure. She offered him small snacks from her purse, adjusted his position to make him more comfortable, and pointed out specific elements of the pageant that might recapture his interest. However, Louis's fatigue manifested in ways that were just as entertaining as his earlier enthusiasm. When he was tired, his facial expressions became even more exaggerated and comical. A float featuring Morris dancers prompted him to make a confused face that was so perfectly expressive of bewilderment that it immediately became another viral moment. The little prince's yawns became as famous as his earlier antics. Rather than polite, concealed yawns, Louis produced enormous, dramatic yawns that seemed to involve his entire body. He would throw his head back, open his mouth wide, and sometimes stretch his arms above his head, creating a display that was both adorable and utterly relatable to parents everywhere. Prince William began to take a more active role in managing Louis's behavior as the afternoon wore on. He would occasionally lift his son onto his lap, point out interesting elements of the parade, or engage him in whispered conversations that seemed designed to help Louis focus and stay engaged. But even parental intervention couldn't completely contain Louis's evolving mood. When a particularly loud marching band passed by, instead of his earlier enthusiastic response, Louis dramatically threw himself backward in his chair, covered his face with his hands, and peeked through his fingers as if the music were almost too exciting to bear. This new theatrical approach to the pageant created yet another series of memorable moments. Louis seemed to have discovered that his exaggerated reactions continued to delight the crowd, so he began to perform his tiredness with the same enthusiasm he had earlier shown for his excitement. The royal family's response to Louis's changing behavior revealed interesting insights into their personalities and parenting approaches. The Queen, despite the formal nature of the occasion, was seen smiling indulgently at her great-grandson's antics. Prince Charles and Camilla exchanged amused glances, clearly entertained by the young prince's uninhibited display. As the pageant featured increasingly elaborate floats, Louis's responses became more and more unpredictable. A float celebrating British literature prompted him to pretend to read an imaginary book, holding his hands as if they contained pages and moving his lips as if reading aloud. This impromptu performance lasted several minutes and created yet another endearing moment. When exhaustion really began to set in, Louis developed a habit of dramatically flopping against different family members. He would lean heavily against his mother, then shift to rest against his father, then occasionally stretch across to his siblings. Each movement was performed with theatrical flair that suggested he was putting on a show about being tired rather than simply experiencing fatigue. The photographers and camera operators had by now recognized that Louis was providing some of the most compelling content of the entire event. Close-up shots of his changing expressions, his yawns, his dramatic poses, and his interactions with family members were being broadcast live to millions of viewers who found themselves more interested in the 4-year-old's performance than in the official pageant. Catherine's patient handling of her increasingly tired son became a masterclass in public parenting. She remained calm, gentle, and responsive to his needs while maintaining her own royal composure. Her ability to balance maternal instincts with royal protocol under the intense scrutiny of global media impressed observers and parenting experts alike. As the afternoon progressed, Lewis's behavior began to cycle between moments of renewed enthusiasm and periods of dramatic exhaustion. When something particularly exciting caught his attention, he would temporarily recover his earlier energy, only to collapse back in a theatrical tiredness minutes later. The other members of the royal family adapted to Lewis's presence with remarkable grace. Rather than showing any signs of embarrassment or frustration with his unconventional behavior, they seemed to embrace his authenticity and even appeared to be enjoying the break from typical royal formality that his presence provided. By this stage of the pageant, Lewis had unknowingly created a new template for royal public appearances. His completely natural, unfiltered responses had shown millions of people around the world that even royal children were, at their core, simply children with all the wonderful unpredictability that entailed. As the Platinum Jubilee Pageant reached its grand finale, Prince Louis had already achieved something remarkable without even realizing it. He had transformed what could have been a stuffy, formal royal event into a celebration of childhood wonder and authentic human emotion that resonated with people across the globe. The final hour of the pageant brought some of the most spectacular displays, including massive floats celebrating different aspects of British culture and a finale featuring hundreds of performers. Lewis's reactions to these culminating moments provided the perfect ending to his unexpected starring role in the day's events. When the enormous golden carriage carrying a hologram of the Queen from her younger years appeared, Lewis's response was one of genuine awe. His mouth fell open, his eyes widened, and for a few precious moments he sat completely still, truly amazed by the technological marvel before him. This moment of quiet wonder provided a beautiful contrast to his earlier theatrical performances. The appearance of celebrity performers during the finale reignited Lewis's enthusiasm, but now it was tempered with the wisdom of a 4-year-old who had learned how to pace himself through a long event. He clapped enthusiastically, but didn't exhaust himself, waved cheerfully, but didn't overdo it, and made faces for the cameras, but with a more controlled energy. As the pageant drew to its close, the impact of Lewis's day-long performance began to become clear. Social media platforms were flooded with videos, memes, and comments about the young prince's antics. News outlets around the world were already preparing stories about how a 4-year-old had become the unexpected star of one of the year's most important royal events. The royal family's final moments in the viewing area revealed how they had all been affected by Lewis's uninhibited joy throughout the day. Even the most formal members of the family were seen smiling more freely, laughing more openly, and seeming more relaxed than they typically appeared at such events. Catherine and William's handling of their son throughout the day had been nothing short of masterful. They had managed to let him be a child while still maintaining appropriate boundaries, allowing his personality to shine while preventing any truly disruptive behavior. Their approach had created a blueprint for how royal parents might balance tradition with natural child development. As the pageant officially concluded and the royal family prepared to leave the viewing area, Lewis provided one final moment of entertainment. He turned to wave goodbye to the crowd below, but instead of a simple wave, he performed an elaborate series of gestures that seemed to be his own interpretation of a royal farewell. The crowd's response to Lewis throughout the day had been overwhelmingly positive. People had cheered his antics, laughed at his expressions, and seemed to genuinely enjoy having a child's perspective represented at such a formal event. His presence had humanized the royal family in a way that formal speeches and carefully orchestrated appearances never could. In the days following the pageant, the impact of Lewis's performance became even more apparent. Videos of his reactions were viewed millions of times, his facial expressions became the basis for countless memes, and his name trended on social media platforms worldwide. Parents shared stories of their own children's similar behavior, creating a global conversation about childhood, authenticity, and the universal experiences that connect all families. Child development experts praised Lewis's parents for allowing him to express himself naturally rather than forcing him into an adult mold of behavior. They noted that his genuine reactions and emotions provided valuable lessons about the importance of letting children be children, even in high-pressure situations. The international media coverage of Lewis's day at the pageant was universally positive. News outlets that typically focused on political analysis or formal royal protocol found themselves celebrating the joy and spontaneity that a 4-year-old had brought to the proceedings. His behavior had reminded viewers that behind all the ceremony and tradition, the royal family was also a real family dealing with the same challenges and joys as families everywhere. Perhaps most importantly, Lewis's day at the Platinum Jubilee Pageant had created a new understanding of what royal public appearances could be. His authentic, unfiltered responses had shown that formal events could accommodate genuine human emotion and spontaneous joy without losing their dignity or significance. As the royal family departed that evening, Prince Louis had no idea that he had just experienced one of the most widely watched and celebrated childhood moments in modern history. To him, it had simply been a fun day watching an amazing parade with his family. But to millions of people around the world, he had provided a masterclass in living authentically, expressing joy freely, and reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply be themselves. The 4-year-old prince had accidentally revolutionized royal public appearances, created countless viral moments, and brought smiles to faces across the globe. Most importantly, he had shown that even in the most formal settings, there is always room for wonder, laughter, and the pure, unfiltered joy that only a child can provide. His day at the Jubilee Pageant would be remembered not just as a breach of royal protocol, but as a celebration of everything that makes childhood magical and universal.